All right, so in this video, we're going to take a look at a few basic methods for both pandas and polars data frames, really focusing on polars. But again, I'm using pandas to kind of show you the similarities and the differences between those libraries as we go. So again, I've got a little bit of code pre-populated here. So importing both pandas and polars, reading in that store sales forecasting data, both using pandas and polars. And we have to do that encoding change because of that unusual character. All right, so really when I'm talking about basic methods here, I'm talking about things that usually I will do immediately when I read in a data frame just to kind of get a sense of, what is going on or what is contained, what am I dealing with here. So first off, you could of course do that seemingly, right, by just printing the thing to the screen, but usually that's not great, right, because it renders out a bunch of stuff. You got to scroll down here to get a scroll bar, and I can't see my column names anymore. And then right here in the middle, notice it's got these ellipses, which is basically saying, oh, well, there's additional columns and additional rows. So it's not a very good way of getting a sense of your data. All right. If you do want to look at a little bit of your data, what I would suggest doing is using something like the head function. So if you use the head function or method and you provide an argument, in this case we're using a pandas data frame, if in this case head 3, this will show me the first 3 rows of that data frame object. Right, so we can at least get a little bit of a glimpse, and I can still access that scroll bar right there. All right. We can also do head. I'm going to change this sales data PD, which is our pandas data frame. We have a PL, which is our polars data frame. We can just change that. And we also have a head method defined pretty much equivalently on a polars data frame. All right, so in addition to head, right, for pandas, we also have a tail method. All right, where it gets the last, in this case, 3 rows. If you don't provide an integer argument, it'll give you it defaults to 5, so it'll give you the last 5 rows. And then we can look at PL. We also have a tail method there as well. So a lot of similarities in both, both libraries with respect to, visualizing or, essentially observing a few rows of your data. All right, I'm just going to cut that out. We also, in both, have a shape attribute. All right, so I've got this data frame. Its shape is 2021 by 21. So it has 2,121 rows, 21 columns. And then if I look at that, right, we have exactly the same thing in polars. Right, so we have a shape, we have head and tail. So this gives me an idea of like, well, okay, well, how big is my data? We've already used head and tail. We can kind of look at what a few of those entries are. A few other things that I would like to do. A lot of times I like to just see the column names, and I actually end up using the column names quite a lot. So if we remember, so pandas has index and columns, but polars only has columns. So in pandas, we could do something like sales data PD. We can actually grab the index, right? And it's a range, right? Because again, if you don't specify when you're reading it that a particular column should be the index, it just creates one. It's a consecutive integer index starting from 0. And in this case, it's going up to 2,121, but it doesn't include that because ranges don't include the last entry. So if we've got 2,121 rows, we've got an index that goes from 0 to 2,120. All right, but of course, if we were to try to do that with polars, right, we don't have an index. Polars data frames do not have indices or an index. All right, but they both have columns. Right, so if we do this with pandas, it gives us back, this index object is interesting. If we look at the type of that thing, it is actually an index type. A lot of times, I'm using that. I might want to change column names, which we can actually just reassign this. If we had a list with exactly the same number of entries, we can reassign that. And I've got an example of that in the pandas basics playlist. All right, but it's an index, right? So it's not like a list. You can convert it to a list by just putting a to list at the end of it. So they've implemented a to list method, so you can get that out to a list, but by default, it's going to come back as this index. Now you can still iterate over it. I could say, for val in and print that. So it is still iterable, so it works just fine. You can just iterate over pd.columns, and that's not going to be an issue. But it's just, it's a pandas object, not, a default, Python object. And if we go to salesdata.pl and do columns, right, they do give us the columns back, and they just go ahead and give it back to us as a list. All right, so we have shape, we have head, tail, we have columns. One thing that we saw in that pandas basics is, let's get that, it was sales data PD. We had a couple of ways that we can, kind of, so one thing about, let's look at this, right? So if I do the head of that pandas, we see the column names, we can see the labels for the index, and we can look at some of the values, and we can make some assumptions about what those the data types are. Like postal code looks to be an integer, city looks to be a string, and so forth. But we really don't know, like, is order date, is that a date time, or is that a string? What is that? So when we were working with pandas, we had to do something like a .info. All right, and we could get that information back. So we could do .info. So that tells us, okay, for each one of your columns, how many of them are not missing, so non-null. And then what's their type? So row ID is an integer. The order date is in fact a string or an object type. Postal code is an integer, and so forth. You could also get at that in a little bit, less fancy. So this prints it out in kind of a tabular format. You could just get back the D types. All right, so it's just saying, hey, row ID is int, and so forth. Postal code is int. All right, and then you also had describe. So this gives us some information about the columns. All right, and what pandas does is it shows you for the numeric columns, by default, you can show all columns. So if I were to go in that describe method, and if I look, there's an include. Let's look, you can include all. And if we do that, right, it gives us information on both, numeric columns and things like ship mode, which is a string. Right, to me, this is a little bit busy, so I kind of like the way that pandas does that by default. So if you do that .describe, right, it just shows you, okay, for the columns that are numeric, what are these, some basic statistics, min, max, and some percentiles, and you can change those percentiles by just providing a list. All right. The same thing can be done with polars, right? At least in the case of describe. So we do have PL, not described. I'm going to take that percentiles argument out. Now, by default, polars returns everything, right? So even if it's it's not a numeric column, like, ship date, right? It's going to do that. So I think the default choice to show you that, I'm sure, is to be explicit. But to me, it just gets a little bit busy. But you can give it that percentiles argument, and you can, right now you've got 25, 50, 75, and you can limit that to just the 50th. All right. One thing I did want to show you, because we were talking about a .info when we looked at pandas, that is not defined on polars data frames. And you do have D types, right? But it gives you those back as a list. Okay. So you might be saying, well, how do I know what this is corresponding to, right? Well, it's just, this first entry is to the first column. So int 64 is the first column, and you can get that back with columns, right? So you could do something like this: for call D type in zip the columns of the D types, right? And then you can print we'll just print call, and then we'll print the type, the D type. All right, so we can get that. We can get that mapping of that, right? So row ID is an integer, postal code is an integer. So you can get at that same information, but the one thing I really want to show you that I think is really nice. So if we went to that sales data.pl or underscore PL, I'm sorry, and then we did a .head 3, notice that you got your type information right there. Right, so whenever you render polars data frames or subsets of polar data frames, or even series to the screen, it goes ahead and it displays the type in that rendering, right? So really not a whole lot of need to go check the D types, because you're going to be able to see that as you're looking through your data, right? So if you're seeing a column that you think should be, you know, a string or an integer, and it's coded as a string, well, that's probably telling you that maybe there's a value in that column that is not set appropriately. All right, so those are some of the basic methods that you can use with polars, very similar to pandas, to just kind of inspect your data upon ingest.